our guest of honour as representative of the Government of Western Australia, and I guess the landlord for this homestead, which has been vested in the Kununurra Tourism Association as a museum, but the Lands Minister, Ben Wyatt, the landlord of Lake Argyle.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everybody. Can I begin by thanking the Mirrawong people, acknowledging the Mirrawong people, Lawford, and the Mirrawong dancers, and the Mirrawong Gadgerong people. Thank you very much for hosting us this morning and this afternoon. To all the Duracs, welcome. I'm not a Durac. Well, I don't think I'm a Durac. Maybe my name's on the thing, I don't know. We'll find out. I am, of course, the Minister for Lands, as Tom has pointed out, but I'm also a keen observer and studier of history, and I'm very, very aware of the significance of today as we acknowledge 40 years since the homestead behind me was moved to this location, but also the fact that we have here an extraordinary turnout of the broader Durac clan as we celebrate the work of Perpetua, who's already spoken, and others to update the family tree. And I think Perpetua's right. Family trees are dangerous things. They always create and bring out history that many of us aren't aware, and that's what makes them exciting and potentially controversial all at the same time. The ambition at the time that Lake Argyle's top dam was constructed was to have relocated all of the materials of the original 1895 Argyle Station homestead. That ambition, partly delivered, says much about the very significant pioneering role of the family we honour here today. The recently updated Durac family tree, meticulously researched by Michael and Perpetua Clancy Durac, in collaboration with a vast number of the Durac family, will from this day be displayed with honour on the homestead in the Homestead Museum. As the Minister for Lands, I'm advised that the land this homestead sits on is a Crown Reserve under the Land Administration Act. However, I speak today not as the landlord of this building, but as a member of the WA Government to celebrate and acknowledge the Durac family and the history that they share, that you share, with the traditional owners of this region. In marking the 40th anniversary of the opening of the Durac Homestead Museum, I want to first speak about the Durac family and honour their connection, which has brought so many of you back here today, and many of you for the first time. We can really appreciate the links, the sentiment and the emotion that binds this family to this place and this museum. And then I want to speak about the Mirrawong people, the traditional owners of this region, whose links to this same place, these same lands, goes back so far beyond those 40 years, which are no more than a blink of an eye, back beyond and before 1895, when this homestead was first built at the base of Mount Mizare, with links that stretch back at least 40,000 years, if not more. Whose stories and songs still connect these Mirrawong families to a rich cultural heritage, with a profound attachment to these lands, leaving in place something that is stronger than sentiment and emotion, attachment and connection that has shaped their whole being and their entire circumstance. I see this homestead as something more than just its stones and timber. I see it as a unifying symbol for a family whose diaspora reaches well beyond Australia's shores. The Duracs are one of Australia's famous families. Their contribution to Australian nation building has been immense and in so many fields. The Kimberley and Northern Australia's pastoral industry, the Ord River scheme, literature, history, art, politics, war service, science, medicine, architecture, law, journalism, global pacifism and reconciliation with First Peoples. You can see this homestead as a symbol for our whole nation because the Durac story, in all its grand scope and intricate complexity, tells so much about the epic story of Australia. It tells us of our shared history, of what we have become together, and of our potential to transcend our colonial history with its generational wounds and become a unified nation that connects modern settler society with ancient Aboriginal society. What we specifically honour and celebrate today is an extraordinary story of reconciliation. We have amongst us several generations of the Durack clan, and in that clan are members of the Skene family from the East Kimberley, who are embraced in the modern, updated Durack family tree. As well as the Durack-Skene family connection, there is the unbroken connection between this family and the Mirrawong people, illustrated in so many ways, including where members of the Durack family continue to work with, and indeed, as pointed out by Lawford just a minute ago, employed by the Mirrawong Aboriginal Corporation. Brad Durack has been mentioned, and Mary Durack, now living locally here in Kununurra, and Will Durack, working with the KLC, with the Kimberley Land Council. These are just some of the many links that the Durack family have maintained with the Mirrawong people. Aboriginal members of the Durack family have been widely referenced over the years. Ribna Green, who is among those who will speak today on behalf of the Skene family, narrated that 1980 iconic film about the Kimberley, On Sacred Ground, where he introduced himself with understated simplicity as a descendant of the Durack family. It was a beautiful opening to a film about Aboriginal and settler tensions in the Kimberley over land use, highlighted at the time by the Nookambah dispute. Ribna's self-identification in that film as both a proud Aboriginal leader and also as a member of the Durack family was a poignant statement about the complex nature of Australian society. It shows that we can't reconcile tensions involving the position of Aboriginal people in the Australian nation through a binary lens. The Durack story throws a powerful light on the broader story of human endeavour, courage and determination of so many settlers who laid the platform to build a first world nation so far from their geographic roots. The Duracks were great Australian nation builders. But we know that the journey of nation building continues, and it is the responsibility of all of us to make our nation better, to dream of the perfect nation, and to pursue that dream. A most urgent challenge to make our nation better is to include Australia's First Peoples into our nation building journey. When Bob Hawke began the 10-year statutory reconciliation process in 1991, I don't think that many people would then have imagined that reconciling the wounds and grievances from our shared history would have become an entrenched feature of Australian nation building. The reconciliation pathway is now wedded into every facet of our society. It includes reconciliation action plans that so many corporations and organisations have developed with a brand of pride, celebrating Aboriginal people in elite sports, acknowledging and welcome to Aboriginal country, reconciliation walks, or in reviewing and renewing family trees. That is why today's event is so significant. We should honour a family who continues to push the frontier of reconciliation. Two of the great matriarchs of the Durack clan, Mary and Elizabeth, told and retold in words and illustrations the story of the Mirrawong world during a period when the very concept of reconciliation could not have been imagined. And Dame Mary, the great chronicler of the family's narrative, was also the first to publish accessible accounts of the lives of two great Aboriginal historical figures in WA, Yagan and Jandamurra. Today's ceremony is made particularly significant because of the participation of the Mirrawong traditional owners, as highlighted by the dancers at the beginning of our ceremony. This is your country, and like every other square inch of Australia's landscape where traditional owners did not surrender their sovereignty to the settlers or governments, Mirrawong fought to protect their lands and way of life, and then, for decades, fought to coexist on their own country. Australia's frontier wars are largely hidden in history. In the East Kimberley, frontier conflict lasted longer than other regions because this country, with its myriad rivers and creeks cutting through the Red Rock Mountains, gave the Mirrawong people sanctuary, albeit a sanctuary that was constantly challenged and impossible to sustain. The modern Mirrawong and Durack family story cannot be told without understanding the relationship between the two. And it is fitting that this ceremony should happen this year with the theme of Reconciliation Week just gone, grounded in truth, walking with courage. There is no greater resonance to that theme than today's ceremony. The original Argyle homestead was built in 1895, when the contest over possession of Mirrawong country, to be known as Argyle Station, was at its fiercest. The truth about that period of conflict can be explored and understood as shared history because the Durack and Mirrawong relationship are transcending that period of violence. But ignoring history delays reconciliation and perpetuates the conspiracy of silence that Dame Mary herself wrote about in her classic book, Kings in Grass Castles. Truth-telling must be a process leading to reconciliation, healing, and the ownership of our shared history. If it is used to blame, to incite anger or entrench victimhood, the process of truth-telling fails. There have been times in the post-Mabo era of native title when governments have used historical information in an attempt to convince the courts to extinguish native title rights. That happened in the Mirrawong-Gadgerong native title claim, generally known as the Ward case, that was heard by the Federal Court in the 1990s. In that case, the state of Western Australia produced detailed historical documents from frontier conflict period, police and settler punitive expeditions, mass imprisonment, forced relocations, in an attempt to prove that the tide of history had washed away the common law rights of the Mirrawong people. That, to me, is a perverse use of historical information. For a state government to mount a legal argument that its own historical intervention, with its impact on the Mirrawong-Gadgerong, through land title allocation and the use of police and other acts of state authority, had so transformed the traditional society that the contemporary rights of the Mirrawong-Gadgerong people were extinguished. This is a shameful abuse of our understanding of history and an undermining of our collective efforts to reconcile that history. The Mirrawong-Gadgerong people, including a number of those who are here today, so powerfully presented their case that the Federal Court and subsequent appeals to the full bench and to the High Court rejected the state's argument and ruled that the Mirrawong-Gadgerong people are indeed the native title holders of their traditional country. How the state government and a host of third-party interests accommodate the legal rights of Mirrawong-Gadgerong is the opportunity for building an ongoing relationship and reconciling the shared history that we have all inherited. I do not regard the Indigenous Land Use Agreement negotiated between the Western Australian Government and Mirrawong-Gadgerong people in 2005 as the final word on native title for the Ord River region. I regard it as one fundamentally important step in the journey to reconcile the shared history of Mirrawong-Gadgerong people and the settlers who have been coming to your country since the early 1880s and making it their home too. What is extraordinary about the reconciliation journey that this nation has embarked upon are the many ironies and the many contradictions that the journey throws up. The story of the Duracks and the Mirrawong people's shared history highlights fundamental ironies in the quest for reconciliation. Beside us sits Lake Argyle, one of the biggest artificial lakes in the southern hemisphere. The rains that filled Lake Argyle in the wet season of 1971 flooded a huge area of Mirrawong traditional country. There was no question at the time of seeking Mirrawong people's consent. Mirrawong weren't even consulted about building the dam and creating farms, irrigation channels in the town of Kununurra. The Ord River scheme was conceived and built well before Australian law changed to embrace traditional ownership and connection. Mirrawong and Gadgerong had no say in what became one of the greatest infrastructure developments in Australian history, yet its impact upon them was devastating. Almost a half a century on, and MG are now becoming equity stakeholders in the Ord irrigation scheme. The long-term prosperity of Mirrawong-Gadgerong people is inextricably linked with the success of the Ord River scheme. This reality is a telling reminder that we should never become victims of history. We should learn from history, own it with transparency, and use it as a basis for community and for nation building. We should be inspired by the grand family patriarch, Patrick Durack, who left Ireland in the 1850s, as so many Irish people did, hunted from their homelands by the Great Famine, Patsy Durack rose from that historical calamity to create a family pastoral empire in a distant land. But he had a keen sense of the dynamic influences in the journey of life and believed that nothing is permanent and linear. In response to a depiction of him as a cattle king, Patrick Durack wrote in 1878, "Then we are kings of grass castles that may be blown away upon a puff of wind." Less than a century later, the remnant epicentre of the Durack pastoral empire, Argyle Downs, was drowned by a sea of water. And here is another irony. Without the enthusiastic, cautious and rigorous advocacy of Patrick Durack's grandson, Kimberley Durack, it is highly doubtful that the Ord River scheme would ever have been established. And we have another superb irony in what can be heard as a beautiful act of reconciliation in the words of the late Dame Mary Durack, found in her most celebrated poem, The Lament for the Drowned Country. The poem is spoken in the voice of Maggie, an old Mirrawong woman with whom Dame Mary grew up and with whom Dame Mary clearly identifies. Where Maggie is mourning the loss of her born country, it is a deeply moving poem about the loss of country for both Mirrawong and for a Durack settler. Part of that poem goes, "I sit along river down from my born country, that heart place. I got to talk to that water. I got to tell that fish, you go back now, talk strong, my country. You tell him that spirit can't leave him, you tell him, wait, hang on, this is not the finish." This is a beautiful poem which captures so much of the spirit in which we gather here today. And indeed, as Dame Mary says, this is not the finish. The journey of nation building and community building and reconciliation continues and grows. And in the quest of recognising the rights of the Mirrawong and Gadjurong people and what was clearly intended in the Ord Native Title Agreement of 2005, I'm pleased to announce today that in my capacity as Minister for Lands, I'll be granting to the Mirrawong Gadjurong Corporation the sole management of Reserve 31165. This reserve, which is part of the traditional country of the Mirrawong, was once part of Argyle Station and the Durack Cattle Empire. Without the skilled labour of the Mirrawong people, the Duracks would never have been able to manage their cattle runs successfully as they did. And I'm delighted, we have a statement of intent that I'm delighted, another Durack, Louise, to hand the statement of intent for the management order to the Chairman of MG Corporation, Lawford Benny. Lawford, where are you?
One more. Thank you. Lord, don't look down. Look at me. Come on, one smile. I'm trying. You missed again. Thanks, mate.
And the Duracks are one family who generously acknowledge the fundamental role that Aboriginal people played in the development of the Northern Australian pastoral industry. And this is another extraordinary signpost in the reconciliation story of the Durack family and the Mirrawong and Gadjurong people. The Durack family brought cattle to this country in the early 1880s after the longest cattle drive ever undertaken anywhere on the planet. Now, more than 130 years later, the Mirrawong traditional owners will run, in partnership, a commercial cattle enterprise on the very land that they will now have control of. I commend the Mirrawong Gadjurong Corporation for their patient negotiation in regaining control and management of this important part of your country. And I commend and honour the Durack family for their extraordinary pioneering endeavours and their commitment over the generations to the higher calling of coexistence and reconciliation with the traditional owners. Thank you.